And if our government thinks that they can just go around the world causing all these problems, but that they won't affect the American people, then they do that at our peril.
The only thing that a monster like Vladimir Putin will understand is that he must be deterred.
The leading proponents of NATO expansion all said, but of course we have to make a special exception for Ukraine. Everyone knows that if we get into a real contest with Russia over dominance in Ukraine, the Russians are going to take it.
Vladimir Putin has called the collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he has spent nearly 20 years trying to reconstitute that empire.
Welcome to the Soho Forum. This afternoon's resolution reads, the United States started the new Cold War with Russia and provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Speaking for the affirmative, Scott Horton. Scott, please come to the stage. Speaking for the negative, Eli Lake. Eli, please come to the stage. Scott, you have 15 minutes to defend your resolution. Take it away, Scott.
Thank you, Gene, and thank you, everyone, especially those involved in helping to put this on, and everyone else for attending and your interest. So I wanted to say at the beginning here to start that I am not an enemy of my opponent up here. I respect Eli Lake. In fact, I cited him in my last book for a really great report he did about a secret torture dungeon in Somalia. Oh, can you hear me okay? And so, hey, that's some sound journalism, and Mr. Lake and I disagree on a hell of a lot, but this isn't personal. We're just debating the issues, that's all. And also, I wanted to, I have to save that, sorry. I've got my notes out of order. I almost don't want to dignify this, but then again, I had an experience the other day that really kind of reaffirmed to me that it matters, that I really need to address this. So even though it might sound silly to some, I hope maybe it'll be important to others, that you understand that there really is a difference between empathy and sympathy, and that if someone tells the whole or what they consider to be a broader part of a story that they think you've heard before, it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm trying to recruit you to the Branch Davidians, or that I myself am a Baathist or a member of Vladimir Putin's party or any kind of thing. I actually don't hold any particular sympathy for Russia at all. I'm a Texan. I don't have anything necessarily against them, but honest, grown human men and women have truly been made to believe that if anybody disagrees, they're just reciting Putin's talking points, or they're in the pay of Russia, or they're somehow loyal to Russia, which is funny because, in fact, if you think about it, there's really no faction of Americans that's loyal to Russia at all, really, even among Russian expats who live here. If you go back to the Cold War, there were American communists who really did favor the Soviet Union. But there's no American-Russian Bund speaking up for Putin and his point of view. There's just a lot of regular American patriots criticizing their own government for doing the wrong thing. And what the hell is this, Russia? Or this is America, where we're supposed to be able to criticize our government when it does the wrong thing. That's all it is. And by the way, there's a brand new book out by a British academic named Jonathan Haslam, and it's called Hubris: The American Role in Starting Russia's War in Ukraine. And the whole book is just about how I'm right about everything. And this is a guy who, the book is published by the Harvard University Press, and he previously taught at Yale and Stanford and Harvard, and now he's at Cambridge. So actually, considering the history of Cambridge, he's more likely to be a traitor than me. But no, he's a good guy, and his book is right on, and I really wish that I had gotten my hands on it before I wrote mine, because I would have poached a lot of stuff out of it. He's got a lot of really great stuff in there. But this is my book. And to start the debate, I'm going to read out of it. No, I'm just kidding. That's just a cheap excuse to bring the book up here and show the YouTube audience later. It's called Provoked: How Washington Started the New Cold War with Russia and the Catastrophe in Ukraine. And so that's what it's about. I've been told that there are some Dartmouth professors here. I didn't know if you guys were here to award me my honorary PhD after, or just for the Q&A section. Look forward to that, though. But anyway, so here's my case, is that America did start the new Cold War with Russia and provoked the catastrophe in Ukraine. And it starts out with the end of the last Cold War. And the Bush senior administration made the Soviets believe that they were going to not only not expand NATO, but they were going to replace NATO. NATO would become a new political organization, sort of like the EU plus America, and they would replace it with what was then called the CSCE. It's now called the OSCE, which the Soviets were already members of. So under this theory, instead of having an alliance, we would have a partnership, and the Soviets, later the Russians, and the Ukrainians, and all of the Eastern European states, and including even the Central Asian stands, we would all be part of it together. So Ukraine's neutrality would be baked right in. And it was based on these promises that the Soviets agreed to reunification in Germany and eventually agreed to let the whole Warsaw Pact go. And based upon this goodwill, the hardliners lost, and the good guys won and overthrew and destroyed the whole Soviet Union. So the promise not to expand NATO wasn't just a promise, it was an agreement. And it was based upon that agreement that the Soviets did the very best thing that they ever did, which was cease to exist. And it was extremely important and meaningful at the time. They also began to screw over the Russians with their shock therapy economic policy and their wars in the Balkans. Now, I'm a libertarian, and as I show in the book, there's a lot of reason to believe the real problem with shock therapy is that they didn't go far enough, and there were still communists in charge of the central bank and other things. And so, contrary to the idea that they got too much capitalism too quick, what actually happened was they only got half-assed Bill Clintonian capitalism in slow motion, and it turned into the complete crony gangsterism of the whole economy and destroyed. Imagine a Soviet communist economy turn to American-style capitalism, and everything gets worse by a lot. And this helped to undermine faith in all the liberal reformers and Democrats and people who wanted to go America's way, just as the wars in the Balkans did, especially the war in Serbia and NATO expansion. The war in Serbia, they launched 3 weeks after they finally brought the first round of expansion of NATO of Poland, Hungary, and the Czech Republic into the alliance. Now, in the 1990s, the brightest light said not to do this. George Kennan, who had coined the containment policy, was only one of them. There's a whole list of hawks on the Soviet Union who were doves on the new Russia. And Kennan said, I'll tell you what's going to happen. The people who are now saying, we can expand NATO, it'll be fine, the Russians aren't going to do anything. The Russians are going to do anything. And when they do, these same people will say, see, that's just how the Russians are, and that's why we need NATO. But that's just wrong. They are creating this self-fulfilling situation, perpetuating the crisis. In other words, instead of a new world order, as Bush Sr. promised, it was the same old world order. It was just now they moved the dividing line from the middle part of Germany, another 1,200 miles east, right to Russia's border. Now, if they were going to live up to their promises and include the Russians in the thing, then it wouldn't make a difference. But they were never going to share that much power with the Russians. So instead, they were only moving the line in a way that threatened the Russians. As even the hawks acknowledged at the time, in the Bill Clinton years, in the W. Bush years, in the Obama years, over and over, Richard Holbrooke, who was the worst of them in the Clinton years, but also Zbigniew Brzezinski and Henry Kissinger, and the leading proponents of NATO expansion, all said, but of course we have to make a special exception for Ukraine. Everyone knows that if we get into a real contest with Russia over dominance in Ukraine, the Russians are going to take it. It's right there. We're 7,000 miles away. And there's, of course, their extremely crucial warm water naval port at Sevastopol. And there's this large ethnic Russian population in the east, where after all the communists drew the border in 1921. There's nothing sacred about that. Crimea only went to them in 1954 based on an edict of the General Secretary of the Communist Party of the Soviet Union. i.e. Holy Writ somehow, I don't know. And so they all recognized, the hawks all recognized, we have to have Ukrainian neutrality baked in, which it was in their constitution. And despite that, the Americans did everything they could in the Bush and especially the Obama years to push the Russians out and to, as they put it themselves, take Ukraine away from Russia and bring it into America's sphere of influence. Now, people say the Ukrainians wanted that, but of course, that by definition has to be an over-exaggeration. Some Ukrainians wanted that. Many of them were very against it. And the polls showed that at no time did a majority support joining NATO or moving all to the way to the West. And there was plenty of skepticism even about the EU. Now, when Bush came in, he tore up the anti-ballistic missile treaty and in effect killed START II, which would have banned all multiple reentry vehicles, which was maybe the worst decision any human man ever made, come to think of it. But he did that, and he also did the color-coded revolutions. Oh, and I'm sorry, he installed these anti-ballistic missile sites in Romania and Poland. That these anti-ballistic missiles are launched from dual-use launchers, the MK or Mark 41 missile launchers that can host Tomahawk cruise missiles that can be tipped with hydrogen bombs. So they started violating the spirit of the INF Treaty first. And they launched what are called the color revolutions. And this started under Bill Clinton, but it continued under W. Bush. USAID and NED are in the news right now. And these are the groups where basically the CIA changed from doing these covert coups d'etats like Iran in 53 and Guatemala in 54 to overt coups d'etats, essentially coups dressed up as revolutions with tens or even hundreds of millions of dollars into these countries to overthrow governments friendly to Russia and there near abroad. And this escalated. The very worst was in the Obama years in 2014. For the second time in 10 years, because W. Bush had done it in 2004, Obama backed a revolution, essentially a putsch against the government. And it's kind of complicated because what the Americans were really after was early elections and to force the president to accept their prime minister and their government. But then the protest movement that they had supported got out of hand and ended up chasing the president right out of town, is how it went down. And I explain that all in the book. And this is really what led to the war. It led immediately to the loss of Crimea when the new government threatened to kick the Russians out of their naval base there. And the Russians reacted by a coup de main, essentially taking their sailors and Marines and occupying the thing. And then John Brennan, who was the director of the CIA, went to Kiev and demanded that they launch a war against the dissenters in the East who were refusing to accept the rule of the new regime. And we know now from Brad Dorfman in Yahoo and an extensive piece from last year in the New York Times that the CIA was there from day one after the revolution and to help, and at the start of the war in April of 2014. And this is really the start of the war. And there's no question that it was America that started it, not Russia. It was in Forbes magazine. They said, John Brennan came to Kiev. The covert war begins today. It was the headline. It was overt as it could be at the time. And that was what started the war. And then they had the Minsk II deals, and the Americans refused to put the pressure on Kiev to implement the thing. And in fact, even when they wanted to implement the Minsk II deal, the Americans thwarted that. For example, in the Trump years, the ambassador, William Taylor, intervened and prevented Zelensky just after he had been sworn in 2019. He tried to work with the Germans on a new proposal for how to implement the deal, and Ambassador William Taylor told them not to do it. Just like Warren Zimmerman back in 1992 helping to get the war going in Bosnia by preventing a peace deal. And of course, well, I guess I mostly have to skip Trump for time here. I'm out of it. I'm sorry, but I will say that he either was as bad as on Russia as any of them, or he had no control over his government's Russia policy for 4 years. The last time around, I think. They said it themselves to the New York Times, a piece called The Quiet Americans, the Russia hands. They said, Trump is like the captain of a ship. He's holding a wheel, but it's not attached to anything. And the permanent national government had their way. The empire had their policy, essentially through including escalating arms sales to Ukraine. And I mentioned Zach Dorfman, who wrote about the CIA role there. He had a great series at the start of the war, and part of that was he quoted the CIA saying that they warned their bosses to tell the politicians to stop sending arms. You're not deterring Russia, you're only provoking them. That was the CIA officers on the ground whose job it was to distribute the weapons they were receiving to the Ukrainians. They said they have this policy, they just think it's going to work that way, but it's not. They're giving the Russians more and more reason to do this sooner than later, is all that they're doing. And in fact, you may have heard of, and I hope you'll look into it, the Rand Corporation report from 2019 called Extending Russia, meaning overextending Russia. In other words, provoking them. The whole thing is how to provoke Russia, how to give them costly problems. We could sabotage the Nord Stream. We could increase support to the rebels in Syria. We could put pressure on the government in Kazakhstan. We could pour weapons into Ukraine. Things, whatever we can do to keep them off balance, to keep them bogged down, to keep them busy. But in that Rand Corporation study, they say at the end of every recommendation, disclaimer, don't listen to us. Don't do this. It'll be terrible. Al-Qaeda could take over Syria. The war in Ukraine could escalate, and the Russians could actually move their regular forces into the country, which would be a catastrophe for us and for our friends. So just because the think tankers we're saying you could do that, we're not saying you should do that, and it's right there. And so then Biden came in, and he spent 2021, and we all know the history of this. He spent 2021, and especially the later part of it, telling the Russians, you better not, but refusing to deal with them in good faith whatsoever, when he truly could have negotiated an end to the war in the East and permanent neutrality for Ukraine going forward. And then, as we all know too, after the war started, his government again scotched a peace deal in order to keep the war going, to weaken Ukraine. And now look at it, they've lost. Anyway, thank you. Sorry.
You have an extra 30 seconds over and above that 15 minutes because Scott took an extra 30. Take it away, Eli.
All right. Well, I'd like to thank the Soho Forum, the Dartmouth Political Union, Gene, and everyone else for coming. Thank you so much. And I want to echo Scott's remarks that today I am coming from a place of respect for Scott's work. We disagree vehemently, but this is not a debate for personal attacks and ad hominem. So I'd like to start my argument by quoting Vladimir Putin. On the eve of the war, the second war against Ukraine that he launched on February 21st, 2022, this is a quote from his speech. Quote, "Since time immemorial, the people living in the southwest of what has historically been Russian land have called themselves Russians and Orthodox Christians. So I will start with the fact that modern Ukraine was entirely created by Russia, or to be more precise, by Bolshevik communist Russia," end quote. So let's leave aside the fake history here. The Bolsheviks opposed Ukrainian independence and only agreed to the federation of Ukraine into the USSR after Vladimir Lenin's policies to outlaw the Ukrainian language and snuff out Ukrainian nationalism had failed. But I want to ask the audience, does that sound like a man who was backed into a corner? Does it sound like a man who has exhausted all of his options, who's trying war only as a last resort? Or let's consider the Russian propaganda campaign itself. Before the war, the second war that Putin started, he insisted, for example, that Kyiv was under the thumb of a Nazi regime, which is a nonsense babbling assertion about a government led by the country's first Jewish president. Or consider the first actions of the Russian army in the 2022 campaign. Did they seek to create, say, a buffer zone out of the range of artillery that Ukraine itself was not even firing into Russian territory? No. Vladimir Putin sent a team of commandos into Kyiv to find Zelensky and to kill him. Did Putin negotiate in good faith with Ukraine or President Joe Biden, who many times sought to call this off? No, he did not. So again, I ask, does this sound like a man provoked? Does it sound like somebody who is only responding to 3 decades of American statecraft to invade his country's neighbor? Of course it is not. Because the 2022 invasion of Ukraine much like Putin's invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014, was not defensive. These are wars of conquest. Vladimir Putin believes he is correcting a historical error. The Ukrainian people, with its unique language, its unique history, its unique culture, and its democratic aspirations, are to Russia's leader entirely a fiction. This was a war to extinguish Ukraine. Now, I am focusing on Vladimir Putin because he's really the only decider in Russia today. And I will not pay him the undue respect of conflating his wishes with those of the Russian people. We know that Putin rules as a tyrant based on this latest war, but so much more. This momentous decision for Russia that has brought misery, or at least economic misery, and global censure to Russia, was not made in consultation with the Russian people or even the Russian Duma. Even when columns of tanks were rolling towards Kyiv at the beginning of this war, Russia's ambassador to the United Nations insisted that they were not, because he didn't know. No one except for Putin and a very small insular circle of advisors really rules Russia today. And he decided to plunge this country into war, a war that has cost the Russians dearly, not to mention the Ukrainians, with no mandate or anything resembling a democratic process. And once this war was started, once the war that Putin started, he decreed that no Russian may criticize it. Contrary to Russian propaganda, Ukrainians do not want to be dominated by Russia. In December of 1991, they made this abundantly clear when 85% of the country showed up to vote on the matter, and 92%, including majorities in the provinces that border Russia, voted for independence. And as his country reeled from economic collapse and a military that was broken by Afghanistan, the war in Afghanistan, the first post-Soviet leader, Boris Yeltsin, recognized the independence of this former Soviet republic, along with the rest of them. And Yeltsin reluctantly accepted the initial expansion of NATO. Now, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but I believe the disintegration of the Soviet Empire was one of the greatest moments of the 20th century. This was a regime that disappeared intellectuals and dissidents and forced them to work as slaves in gulags, that poisoned and murdered its critics abroad. This was a regime that turned Ukraine, the breadbasket of the empire, into a wasteland, deliberately starving millions of its citizens between 1932 and 1933 in what we know today as the Holodomor. But not everyone agrees with me on this. Vladimir Putin has called the collapse of the Soviet Union, quote, the greatest geopolitical catastrophe of the 20th century. And he has spent nearly 20 years trying to reconstitute that empire, if not its discredited economic system. That is what explains the Cold War today between America and Russia. Putin is not responding to a real threat. He is clinging to the nightmare of a lost empire. And until fairly recently, we should say that Russia was actually pretty stealthy in its efforts to exert dominion over the former republics of the Soviet Union. Until its invasion of Georgia in 2008, Russia outsourced its dirty work to its intelligence services. Here I want to read briefly from a 2007 cable from U.S. Ambassador to Georgia John Teft. It was released in 2010 by WikiLeaks. Quote, while the Russians typically make some effort to reduce their fingerprints on actions, making it hard to say with 100% certainty that they are responsible for many of them, the cumulative weight of evidence of the last few years suggests that the Russians are aggressively playing a high-stakes, covert game, and they consider few, if any, holds barred. Now, I should say that is written in 2007. That is a year before Russia invaded the Republic of Georgia. And that high-stakes covert game included such things as firing ground-based missiles at the headquarters of the pro-Georgian government in exile of Abkhazia, a breakaway province, a bombing of a police station in Gori, and the sabotage and bombing of natural gas pipelines in North Ossetia. All of these direct actions, as they are known by Russia's GRU, preceded that open invasion in 2008. In 2007, Russia also conducted a massive cyber attack against Estonia for having the temerity to remove a Soviet-era bronze statue of an unknown soldier. In Belarus, more recently, after Alexander Lukashenko stole the presidential election, Putin shored up his regime as it conducted mass arrests. In exchange, Belarus has allowed Putin to use his country as a staging ground for its war on Ukraine. Even in 2014, When it was obvious that Russia had invaded Crimea and the Donbass, Putin still denied that his forces were involved until much later. Now, we should notice a theme in all of this. Vladimir Putin is absolutely terrified that any former Soviet republics might seek an open society for themselves. We know this for a few reasons. Russian propaganda has labeled every grassroots democratic movement a Western provocation. Doesn't matter whether this was the Rose Revolution in Georgia, the Orange Revolution in Ukraine, or the Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. Anytime citizens organize themselves against an autocrat or protest a stolen election, the Kremlin will claim it's really the National Endowment for Democracy, the CIA, the State Department, or some other NGO. The Russian Foreign Ministry's 2023 concept paper, which is the kind of equivalent of its statement of official policy, comes close to making all of this explicit. In the section on Russia's near abroad, which is a euphemism for the former republics, it says that Russia's goal is, quote, establishing an integrated economic and political space in Eurasia in the long term. And that is nothing wrong with that. Fair enough. One would expect it. But the section then goes on to emphasize its Russian policy to prevent and counter, quote, unfriendly actions of foreign states and their alliances which provoke disintegration processes in the near abroad and create obstacles to the exercise of the sovereign right of Russia's allies and partners to deepen their comprehensive cooperation with Russia. In other words, Georgia, Ukraine, and Belarus are free to make their own decisions so long as they decide to embrace comprehensive cooperation with Russia. Now, this conceit that the former republics are free to make their own decisions only if they choose correctly helps explain Putin's rewriting of recent history when it comes to the Maidan Revolution in Kyiv, or the Revolution of Dignity. To understand this full story, it's really important here to get into the weeds, talk a little bit about the man who fled his own country for Russia at the end of February 2014. His name is Viktor Yanukovych. He came from the east of Ukraine, an industrial base that historically was closer to Russia than Kyiv and the Ukraine's western provinces. Yanukovych was president during the Orange Revolution, when protesters flooded Kyiv to protest what they saw as the stolen election. Yanukovych agreed to run off, and then he lost that election. He ran again in 2010, and he did win legitimately. And after he won, he did a number of favors for Moscow. He officially declared, for example, that Ukraine would no longer seek membership in NATO, a process that was always doomed to fail. We can get into that in the back and forth. But one that is used, at least as by Russia, this membership into NATO, and its defenders as a pretext for the current war. He also agreed, by the way, to a long-term lease for Russia's Black Sea Fleet in Sevastopol. Nonetheless, Yanukovych and his party of regents campaigned on the promise of Ukraine joining the European Common Market, the EU. And at the moment when the entire 5-year negotiations was about to conclude in 2013, Vladimir Putin demanded that Ukraine's president pull away from the deal. And Yanukovych acknowledged, by the way, as much of this on state television at the time. And the sudden reversal, the president's caving to a hostile neighbor, enraged millions of Ukrainians who took to the streets in protest, most notably at the Capitol in Maidan Square. Now, according to the Kremlin, this was all astroturf. But there's no evidence to support the claim that were it not for some training from the NED, none of this would have happened. Ask yourself, who's really interfering here in the sovereignty of Ukraine? Is it the National Endowment for Democracy, or is it Vladimir Putin? So, I ask all of this because the story that Putin tells of 2014 is that the protesters at Maidan, in fact, were the aggressors. But no one, and I mean no one, should believe this. It's true that 13 police officers and security officers were killed in these clashes between November 2013 and February 2014. Compare that to 100 protesters that were killed by these security forces. And then consider that the bulk of those protesters, 78 of them, were killed between February 17th and February 20th. And that's a very important time, because that is the same period where you saw Poland, United States, and France trying to negotiate a way out of the standoff. Now, the interior minister at the time, someone by the name of Vitaly Zakharenko, I might be mispronouncing that, was being advised by the Russian operatives, and it was his forces that escalated the conflict. And then suddenly, they vanished. And it was Again, a shock to everyone. Yanukovych fled Russia, and Ukraine's parliament voted to then strip him of his office. I should note that Zakharenko also fled eventually to Moscow and was rewarded with a job as a senior advisor to the Russian state-owned military tech concern known as Rostek. Now, we all know what happened after that. Putin sent his little green men into Crimea and his GRU advisors into the Donbass. He couldn't coerce Ukraine's president to join his economic union, so he decided to make war until he got what he wanted. Does that sound like someone who was provoked by U.S. foreign policy? To explain this war of conquest as a reaction to the expansion of the North Atlantic Treaty Organization gets it precisely backwards. The expansion of NATO was driven by the present fears of former captive nations who knew Soviet domination firsthand. Former dissidents like Lech Walesa and Václav Havel, who could go on to lead Poland and the Czech Republic, said this explicitly in the 1990s as NATO expanded. They feared that one day Russia would seek to reconstitute the empire it lost in 1991, and it's a testament to the strength of NATO that Poland and the Czech Republic have survived as independent states as Ukraine fights for its life. Havel and Walesa were right. But as libertarians and all people of conscience should also understand, Putin's real enemies are not Western NGOs or the US government or even NATO. It is his own people. His real fear is that his own citizens will see Ukrainians, Georgians, Belarusians one day thriving and living in democratic societies, and that his own population will ask why they must live under the thumb of a tyrant when their neighbors do not.
A rebuttal from Scott Horton. You want to take the podium? Yeah, okay, go ahead. Yeah.
All right. Let's see if I can read my own notes here. All right. So there are a lot of issues that he raised there, and I took my notes in the order that he raised them. So I hope this won't be too incoherent the way I try to respond here. The quote of the time immemorial and all that. Well, he did say that. Vladimir Putin did in his two different declarations of war at the beginning of 2022, at the end of February, he did talk on and on about the ancient history of Russia and Ukraine and their civilization starting in Kiev and this and that. But he also said, roughly paraphrasing, I didn't write down, I didn't have a prepared thing with the quotes here, but he also said that, look, we tried independence and we let that stand. But the problem was they couldn't just be independent. The Americans had to try to take them away. Essentially, he did talk about the influence of National Socialists in the government, but he also talked about how America had essentially colonized the government of Ukraine. I have a quote in the book where I honestly wouldn't have believed this if it wasn't Victoria Nuland herself testifying to the U.S. Senate and explaining how there were American bureaucrats embedded at every level of the Ukrainian government, picking and choosing winners at every level of decision-making there. And so it was only a bit of an exaggeration, the way he talked about how America was so determined to have dominance in Ukraine at the expense of Russia. So, in other words, he said, he implied, or he was saying, and I think credibly, the guy's been president for 20 years before that and more, that he didn't have reason to go until we gave him reason to go. It wasn't just for romantic reasons to reunite this ancient people or something like that. And I agree, by the way, with Mr. Lake when he criticizes Putin and said, does this sound like a guy who has exhausted all of his options? I agree that no, it does not. And I wrote in the book is called Provoked, Not Justified. And I do not argue, as I think very few do, that the Russians had no choice but to do this. I'm arguing essentially that America put his back to the wall and he decided to not wait until we got him all the way in the corner. But that was in the process of happening. And a big part of that was the military standardization, building up their military and what they call interoperability, and making Ukraine's military a de facto member of NATO in everything but the Article 5 guarantee. So in other words, if NATO and Russia went to war, Ukraine would be another auxiliary army as part of NATO, whether they were a full-fledged member or not. And we were tipping that balance and pushing it that way. There's a great interview of Gideon Rose in 2014, the editor of Foreign Affairs, explaining to the old funny Stephen Colbert about how, yeah, we're taking Ukraine away. He says that Ukraine is Russia's girlfriend, and we're breaking them up and moving them from their ghetto boyfriend to a nice yuppie in the suburbs, and sticking it to Putin. And he and Colbert talk about, why isn't Obama spiking the football? Well, because he could get upset and roll his tanks in there if we push it too far. And they acknowledge the risks that they were taking right then and there. And I'm so sorry I had so little time. But let me see what I think is the very best thing to try to address here. I'll end with this. Imagine if Ronald Reagan had spent America into bankruptcy on militarism in the 80s, and it was America that had fallen apart and lost our empire at the end of the Cold War, and the Soviets had expanded into Western Europe, into Latin America, and now they keep overthrowing the government of Canada because the people of Canada keep voting wrong and electing the wrong guy. And then when the people of Vancouver in BC refuse to accept the rule of the new coup d'etat junta, they declare war against them and attack Vancouver and threaten to kick us out of all of our naval bases in Alaska. What do you think America would do? We would invade Canada and probably nuke Moscow. And, a journalist named Christopher Lane asked this question about Mexico and China to a bunch of generals. And they said, first threats, then sanctions, then war. And he said to them, well, how do you think the Russians feel about what we're doing in Ukraine? And they said, we never thought about it that way before. Because as we say when we expand, this is purely defensive. It's purely defensive. And you must accept, because we say so, that it's purely defensive, even though they continue to make offensive moves in various places, including the wars in Serbia, Afghanistan, and Libya. So after all, the war in Afghanistan, they let Osama go and attack the Taliban instead. So that doesn't really count as self-defense, does it? But I'm not an apologist for the Russian war. And here, by the way, are some examples. He could have shut off all the gas to Europe. He could have promised to obstruct all UN business on the Security Council. He could have marched unarmed peacekeepers into that territory. He could have gotten creative in trying to find ways to prevent that war if he had really been determined to, but he wasn't.
Somebody Eli, yeah, take it away, Eli.
Okay, well, I want to respond to a couple things. First of all, I mean, the United States has a vast kind of foreign policy apparatus. I would not say it's picking winners and losers in Ukraine, and that is a separate issue. But we know from the fact that they keep electing people in Ukraine and leaders in Ukraine that they want to remain independent. And indeed, the pro-Russian guy, Yanukovych, campaigned on Ukraine joining the European Union and only backed away from that when Putin said it was unacceptable. But I want to kind of take this time for a minute to just sort of offer an alternative history of U.S. and Russia in the Cold War or after the Cold War. So the first thing I should say, the number one issue for the George H.W. Bush administration, the Clinton administration, and the George W. Bush administration was finding the nuclear weapons and making sure they did not end up in the hands of terrorists. That was the biggest national security priority after the collapse of the Soviet Union. And in many ways, George H.W. Bush and all those presidents, they deserve a lot of credit because it could have been much worse. So that was what was driving it. But this idea that we sort of went headlong into expanding NATO and violated a handshake agreement when Mikhail Gorbachev agreed to the unification of Germany, in my view, I understand that there have been recently released and declassified kind of diplomatic memoranda that Scott gets into in his book in great detail. I want to just quote from James Baker, who was leading those negotiations, and what he said in an interview in 2014. The bottom line is that is a ridiculous argument. And what Baker is saying there is that it was an opening position. He was exploring it in the context of negotiation, but by the time they had a final agreement on German unification, any kind of proposal or any kind of commitment not to expand NATO was not there. So this is something that, I should say Vladimir Putin and the Russian Foreign Ministry bring up, that they believe they had this understanding. I do not think that the record supports that. So I want to put that out there. The other thing I would say is that there was a lot the United States did for Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. For example, and this is a big one that is often forgotten, Boris Yeltsin in 1992 had to fire on his own parliament and basically kind of decreed that he was going to be effectively a dictator. And that would have been a moment for Clinton to say, you're on your own, buddy, but he supported him 100%. The United States, there is a huge debate to have on economic shock therapy. It is worth having that, and very interested to kind of hear Scott Horton's views on how it wasn't enough, but that's a fine argument to have. But nonetheless, you cannot deny the United States helped lead for the restructuring of Russian debt through the Paris Club. It opened up the IMF for new investments. There were all kinds of things the United States did in the 1990s and 2000s to try to get Russia back on its economic feet. Finally, after Russia invades Georgia and nearly marches all the way to Tbilisi, the next president, Barack Obama, announces a new policy called the Reset, which pretty much ignored that aggression. So this argument that the U.S. policy has been unrelentingly hostile to Russian interest, in my view, is just not true. What the United States has been hostile to are the efforts of Moscow to reconstitute, if not its borders and certainly its influence, what it calls its near abroad, which I talked about in my opening remarks. And that's because the people who have to live in these former Soviet republics are hostile to it. They don't want to live under the Russians. And the United States, I think because of its values, because we are a democracy, we believe in these basic ideas that people have a right to self-determination, we would support that. But what we saw, I think, since 2022 is that Putin has seriously miscalculated. The Ukrainians don't want to live under the Russians, full stop. And neither do the Georgians don't want to live under the Russians. And I would bet if you ask Belarusians, they don't want to live under the Russians either. And so in that respect, to say that this is somehow poor policy or something like that, no, I think it is simply respecting that there are more people in this conversation than just the guy who runs the Kremlin and the guy who runs the White House. There are the actual people who have to live in these areas, and they don't want to live under the Russians. And that's what it means, by the way, to get rid of the Soviet Union. If it means anything, it means that these are going to be independent countries. And if you want to blame somebody for the state of affairs, I would blame the Russians at this. The response to their aggression is what you're seeing right now. So thank you.
Thanks to you both. We now go to a couple of phases of the Q&A portion of the afternoon. First, before you line up to ask your questions, the debaters will have the right to exercise that option at any time and can exercise that option right now. Eli, Scott, do either of you want to ask a question of the other at this point? Yeah. No?
I'm good if Scott...
You're good?
Yeah, no, I don't think I have anything.
Okay,
Sorry.
waive the opportunity. I'm going to exercise moderator's prerogative to ask a question that puts a finer point, to my mind, on a couple of issues. Scott, are you saying that had you been in the Russian administration, you would have opposed the invasion of Ukraine, and you would have pointed out, and could you elaborate on what else Putin could have done to avoid invading? You would have supported those alternatives, and what would those have been?
Okay, well, so the first one on my list, I believe it was the journalist Aaron Maté who suggested that what he could have done, because the real run up to the war began at the end of the year in 21. So what he could have done is shut off all the gas to Western Europe and say that, playing real hardball and drive up their prices then and make it clear how serious he was. He could also have obstructed all council business on the UN Security Council and vowed to continue to unless they adopted a plan that had already been floated back in 2018 to put international peacekeepers from a third uninterested country on the border there to the so-called gray zone ceasefire line in the civil war to end the fighting in the East. And And, David Swanson is a great left-wing peace activist, I believe from California, and he wrote a piece where he had 30 ideas of nonviolent things that Putin could have done, some of which sounded kind of absurd, but actually even weren't. And I didn't know about this till I learned it from him, that this is part of how the Baltic states kicked the Soviets out, was with giant mobs of civilians singing songs and basically force marching the Soviet army to withdraw into Russia at the fall of the Soviet Union in 1991, peacefully. And how if Putin wanted to be creative and force an end to the Civil War, he could have done anything along those lines. And for that matter, he could have made it very clear in January and February when they were saying that he's going to invade and he was saying, no, I'm not. He could have and should have said, you're damn right I'm going to. That's my threat. Give in on this and this issue and make it very clear. And instead, by playing coy, I kind of joke in the book that perhaps military necessity required diplomatic incompetence, because his generals were saying, well, you don't want to just announce what you're going to do. But so that meant he couldn't play as hard a hardball as he should have played. And then, as long as I'm rambling, I want to bring up what Eli said about James Baker there. And he's right that in the final treaty that they signed for the reunification of Germany, they don't have a promise not to expand NATO in there. However, they do agree not to move substantial military equipment into the former GDR, which showed that they were still respecting the spirit of that promise. And after all, again, they were promising that they were going to transform NATO. Baker himself from the beginning was saying, we're going to transform NATO. It's not even going to be a military alliance anymore. We're going to replace it with the CSCE and later the Partnership for Peace. So they sort of made that argument moot. And then also, though, I would point out that when Bill Clinton signed the Founding Act of 1997, when they let them know we are expanding NATO, but you know what, we're going to make this NATO-Russia Council and let you be part of the discussion. In that Founding Act, they also promised not to move military forces into any of the new NATO countries in Eastern Europe. Yes, we'll let them join our alliance. No, we will not further encroach militarily. And of course, then W. Bush came right up and tore that up and started putting those anti-missile systems into Romania and Poland in violation of that agreement. So, and as I show in the book, it doesn't always have to be a Senate-ratified treaty to be a meaningful agreement, except the Americans, hell, even a Senate-ratified treaty, they'll just tear that up when they feel like it, as they do over and over again.
Nilay, do you have any comment on the question or Scott's answer?
I mean, I think it's true there are handshake agreements in diplomacy all the time and understandings, as you point out in your book. That was how the Cuban Missile Crisis was resolved. But this is, I think, not one of those. And I also think that the situation over time changes. That one of the reasons why later, at least, I'm speaking now under Obama, that you saw more military assets put into the Baltic states and Poland is because of the 2014 larceny of Crimea and Putin's kind of first war in Ukraine. So a lot of this is responding to what Putin is doing and how he is becoming ever more aggressive. So it's not all one kind of thing. I mean, I also would say that you are very critical of the Partnership for Peace in your book. And I'm sure that there are plenty of policy disagreements that one can have and say could have been said that about anything. But there were many efforts made to reassure the Russians in terms of NATO. It wasn't as if they just said, spend it and we don't really care what you think. There were all kinds of ways in which there was an effort to try to bring in, for example, Russia was brought into the G7. Russia was there were all kinds of ways in which US presidents of both parties were trying to recognize and respect Russia in a way that said you're still a great power, and at the same time address the very real concerns of countries like the Czech Republic and Poland and all these other countries, which had, as we now see, good reason to fear revanchism from the Russians.
Yeah. Now I have a question for you, Eli, and it's
Sure.
a two-part related issue. What do you think of the Monroe Doctrine analogy? I'd mentioned President John F. Kennedy assassinated the Friday before I came here 61 years ago. He said in his inaugural address, we aim to be master of our own house. and that was construed to mean that essentially both North and South America were off limits to any foreign power. So the application argument has been made that Russia is, in effect, declaring the same thing, that we're using a double standard by not granting them their own Monrovsky doctrine, so to speak, that countries that are as close to them as South America or Cuba or other Mexico is to us are off limits to great powers or great power presences. And then on a related point, is it true to say that a month into the invasion in April, after the Russians did invade, there was a peace agreement on the table, and that was vetoed by Boris Johnson, is the argument. Would you, first of all, grant the Monroe Doctrine analogy? How would you address it? And second, would you have supported, certainly at least for the benefit of hindsight, the April agreement that Zelensky probably would have signed had the U.S. and Britain told him not to sign it?
Those are both
Address
good
those
questions.
Yeah,
Let me start with the Monroe Doctrine.
please. Yeah.
I don't think it's really analogous for a couple of reasons. First of all, the Monroe Doctrine was kind of developed in a much different world when there were European powers that literally would have colonial possessions in our hemisphere.
Well, Kennedy repeated it.
I understand.
Yeah.
Let me get there.
Sure.
Okay. If you want to sort of take it into the modern Cold War context, the United States tolerated very left-wing governments in, say, Mexico. I don't want to defend Nixon's policies or Johnson's policies or Kennedy's policies in terms of, particularly in Chile, where I think you would say that we have lots to criticize of the U.S. supported coup against Allende. But when you're and it was a kind of comedy of errors if you look at the Bay of Pigs and all of the kind of bizarre assassination plans that Bobby Kennedy approved. I don't know if we would look back at that and we'd say, as Americans, we're really proud of that moment, and we would, hope. And the second thing that's not really comparable is that there wasn't a kind of disintegration of the United States the way there was of the Soviet Union. The Soviets lost the Cold War. They lost the Cold War in part because all of these countries didn't want to live under them. So I don't think that you can really make an apples to apples comparison. Now, as for that peace agreement, I do not know whether it was Boris Johnson that nixed it, or whether it was Joe Biden. I think we're going to have to wait for the history books on that. But from what I understand, I mean, my position on this is that I support that the leader of Ukraine is the guy that the Ukrainians elected, Volodymyr Zelensky, and Zelensky should be allowed to make the peace that he wants to make. And if Zelensky, and my understanding, and it could be wrong here, is that offer was that it was relegating Ukraine to a kind of Finland neutral status, given the fact that the Russians violated their own agreement with their own commitment with the Budapest Memorandum, this agreement that said that they were going to have invested in protecting the sovereignty and security of Ukraine, and then trampled all over their word. Why would you trust some agreement that said, all right, we're going to be neutral and you're not going to invade us? Why would you trust anything from the Russians at that point if you're Ukraine? So I'm not entirely sure that Zelensky wanted it and Johnson said no. So that's where I would sort of respond there.
Comment from you, Scott, on that question, and/or on Eli's response to that question.
Sure. First of all, on the overall point about it was the countries of Eastern Europe that wanted to join our alliance. And so what were we supposed to do? Turn them away? The answer is, yeah, maybe, at least. Even Bill Clinton said that actually the opinions of these Eastern European states is not really what counts. What matters is what's good for the United States of America, especially over the long term. And that would be our relationship with Russia. And so Poland and these other countries have to come later in that calculation. Now, he didn't follow his own advice on that, but that was a very reasonable position for him to stake. It's American national security that matters the most to Americans. And further, you can't rerun the counterfactuals, so you don't really know. But it does help that, as I said, George Kennan and many other Cold War hawks predicted that exactly this would happen. The Russians will react, and then the people who say, don't worry, they won't react, will then say, see, this is why we have to defend Eastern Europe, is because of how aggressive the Russians are when they're reacting to what we've done. And so it's very much a self-fulfilling situation there. And then there's an analogy there. George W. Bush insisted that the government of Mexico militarize and take on the cartels. And then the cartels also militarized much more heavily, and violence got much worse. And the anti-terror Special Forces Squad became the Zetas, the biggest and worst cartel, because they decided, why be anti-drug warriors when you could be a drug dealer instead and make a lot more money? And so are you going to blame W. Bush for that? Well, yeah, like to some degree. Are the Zetas still responsible for their own behavior? Yes, but also American foreign policy, being the 800 trillion ton megaton gorilla here, has a lot of influence in these countries. And as Ron Paul said, the CIA is right, and we should pay attention when they teach about blowback. It means the consequences of the things that the CIA does. And if our government thinks that they can just go around the world causing all these problems, but that they won't affect the American people, then they do that at our peril.
All right. I believe Eli wants to comment. Go ahead, Eli.
Go ahead, Chuck.
On the NATO question and Ukraine in particular, there was a process known as a membership action plan. It was supported by the George W. Bush administration. It was always opposed by the governments of France and Germany. And when there was something known as the Bucharest Summit, it was very clear that it would be eons until Ukraine would actually become a member of NATO. And then, after Yanukovych wins a legitimate election in 2010, he makes it the official policy of Ukraine that it is no longer seeking to join NATO. All of this happens before 2014. So I don't understand, if the concern is NATO and Ukraine's going to join NATO and that's a bridge too far, then by the time, I mean, that is kind of all, a dead letter in 2014. The only reason, by the way, it comes up again is because Putin invaded Ukraine and they're looking to get as many allies as they can. Right. And then finally, what I would just say on this is that, remarkably, the countries that haven't been invaded by Putin are the countries that are in NATO. So, I mean, I would argue the opposite of what you said. I would say that Ukraine would be territorially whole right now if back in 2008, we'd accepted them and we accelerated their membership action plan. It didn't work out that way. I think you and I would both agree that it was the worst of all worlds, which is that you raise the question and then leave them hanging. That was a terrible decision.
That's what I was just going to say.
Poor statecraft on the part of George W. Bush. But I think that augurs for my side of the argument on the question of the U.S. provoking Russia as opposed to yours.
Okay, can I respond?
Yes, you.
Okay, great. I didn't have time to get to Bucharest before. So here's the thing about Bucharest. The ambassador to Russia, who is Joe Biden's CIA director, William Burns, and the entire staff of the embassy in Moscow, also the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice, the Secretary of Defense, Robert Gates, who slammed Bush for it in his memoir, and Fiona Hill, you all remember, testified against Bush during against Trump during the impeachment, who was Bush's Russia expert on the National Security Council, along with Thomas Graham and the entire National Security Council. So that's the ambassador, the embassy, state, defense, and the entire NSC told W. Bush, don't do it. And he said France and Germany opposed it. Same reason. Only one reason why. It's an unnecessary provocation against the Russians. No one else had any other argument against it other than you're just going to pick a fight unnecessarily and cause a problem. And then what happened was France and Germany absolutely put their foot down and refused to allow Bush to give them an official invitation. So he gave them this sort of half a one and made his intention clear that we're going to continue again with the militarization of Ukraine. We're going to sell them weapons. We're going to standardize their military along as we do do with all of the new NATO countries. It's called interoperability, so that they can use the same radios, the same type of weapons, the same command and control systems to fight with us, but without the war guarantee. And so it's not just him and it's not just me, but it's 10 other experts from the Council on Foreign Relations and all the big universities said this is the worst of all worlds.
Okay,
It is essentially just saying you and him fight.
Okay, we now go over to the audience version of the Q&A. Please ask your question. As a question, I'm going to sit down a moment and solicit the first question. Please go ahead. Yeah. And address, both tell us who you want to address the question to, but both will get a chance to address it. Go ahead.
Yes, sir. My question is to Mr. Lake. Something that you kind of seem to, I don't want to say dismiss, but might not have given enough time to, is the infamous F the EU phone call that was leaked.
Sure.
Victoria Nuland was with it. I think that speaks, how would you rebut the view that that speaks to large entrenchment of U.S. bureaucracy and political statecraft within the Ukrainian government state?
Could you elaborate on that phone call just for briefly? What was the phone call?
So the broader strokes of it was in the aftermath of the Maidan Revolution that came about. There was a phone call between Victoria Nuland and I forget the other gentleman, where they were discussing pretty flippantly who they were going to maneuver into and usher into this new government that was left in the vacuum when the outgoing president fled. And he said, well, what do you think? That the person speaking with Victoria Nuland said, well, should we consult the EU or what are they going to think about this? And she said, F the EU, pretty explicitly. So basically, how do you refute that? That pretty much shows that the U.S. political state was pretty confident in their position of calling the shots in a foreign country bordering Russia.
Yeah.
Okay, well, first of all, I would tell you that as somebody who's covered diplomacy for a very long time, that those kinds of conversations are had by all kinds of senior, foreign policy officials from all kinds of countries. So she was stating her preference for who they would like to see in an interim government. The position of the United States was the same as the position of the European Union and all the Western allies, which was there should be elections. And that is what happened. And by the way, who ended up getting, this, I'm going to not pronounce his name. He's, the chocolate oligarch, Peter
Poroshenko.
Yeah, Poroshenko. Right. That was not on her bingo card. So yes, there were preferences for who should be in certain positions. It was leaked. It was, by the way, a snippet of a phone conversation. We haven't heard the entire one. I guarantee you that there were similar conversations that were being held by, German undersecretaries and so forth about who they would like to see. And I don't think it really tells us all that much. And I think it pales in comparison to what we know Vladimir Putin did to influence the outcome of the elected government of Ukraine. He basically said, you cannot sign this agreement that you campaigned on that had been 5 years in negotiations. And, Yanukovych caved. I mean, that right there is the cause of the crisis. So, it's interesting, sort of a new kind of political information warfare, using intercepts and selectively disclosing them. But I don't really think it tells us all that much. But good question.
Comment from you, Scott, on the question and answer.
Yeah. Okay. Just a little bit of clarification there. I'm not exactly sure what all difference it makes, but the leak actually came out before the coup or the putsch, really sort of street putsch. It really happened 2 weeks later. And in the call, you're right, she doesn't talk about the president because the discussion is this transitional period. They're calling, but the thing is, she's not just expressing her opinion. She's clearly making the decision. She is calling the shot of who is to be the new prime minister in the new government. And that's Arseniy Yatsenyuk, and who is in fact the guy who became the prime minister after the so-called revolution a couple of weeks later. To backtrack a little bit about the cause of the thing, it's true that the Russians absolutely were playing hardball about the negotiation. But, just earlier today, I mentioned that book by Jonathan Haslam, where he wrote the same book as me, only all different sources. And one of the things in there is he's quoting Henry Kissinger, railing against the Western diplomacy here. And he said, This is the kind of thing that should have taken. He talked about like Turkish entry into NATO was this extended discussion that lasted for years and whatever before they did it. This is the kind of thing that should be, relentlessly negotiated, and that this is Kissinger is absolutely deriding the American position as telling the Russians, this is how it is. If you don't like it, screw you, shut up, go away. And I would also note that George Soros, who's very invested in this, and I don't mean like people blame Soros for every little thing. I just mean he very much was invested in this. And he blamed Angela Merkel in The Guardian and said this was all her fault because she played such stupid hardball with the Ukrainians. The deal to get association, they were only going to get a $5 billion loan, which would barely cover their interest from last year, would barely help them roll over their previous debt, and then included with a massive austerity program and cuts to subsidies on fuel and welfare for little old ladies and Medicaid and whatever, this kind of thing. And where the Russians said, I'll give you $15 billion and at a discount interest rate. And then and it was really both sides. And I think the Europeans first that said that, and you can't have a deal with the other guy. And so they were both playing way too hard of hardball there, and they failed. But it was even extremely powerful and influential guys on the American side who blamed their own side for botching the thing and screwing it all up. And he's right, by the way, too, what he said earlier, which most people don't understand, was that Yanukovych wanted to move west. He was not Putin's puppet. He wanted to move west, but they essentially made it impossible for him to do so. And I'll recommend to you, there's a great interview of Paul Manafort, who you might remember was falsely accused of being Putin's controller of Trump back 8 years ago. And because of his association with Yanukovych, but he did this wonderful, like 2-hour-long interview on the Patrick Bet-David show, which you can find on YouTube, where he explains he was hired to help Ukraine move west. And that was his whole job in doing that. But again, I think Kissinger and Soros are right that it was the Western side that botched it. And then they almost always, even in the middle of a conversation about it, you might note that the story still resets and starts with the seizure of Crimea, not with the overthrow. And that was what Carl Gershman, the head of the NED, called it, the successful overthrow of the government of Ukraine.
Next question.
Mr. Horton, if I may, I'd like to address my question to you. Your argument strikes me as, and there's nothing wrong with it, sort of a traditional, almost realist argument where one state is increasing its power and that incurs a reaction from another state, which kind of suggests that it really doesn't matter if this is the US and Russia or Trump and Putin or Joe Biden and Putin. It could be any two states. Do you think that this sort of situation would have played out if Putin were not running the Kremlin? If somebody else were running the Kremlin, do you think that we would have had the same sort of incident or sort of war?
Yeah, well, I am not a student of the realist school. I'm a libertarian, and I'm much more individualist in my perspective. So to me, it always comes down to the decisions that the individual men and women are making at the time and the strategies that they decide to sign off on. Right, like the Pentagon Joint Staff might write up a whole thing, but the president has every right to dismiss that and say, no, we're not doing that. And so he could or not. I think we're seeing right now how consequential it is sometimes who wins an election, and particularly if one is a declared rogue with some freedom of action. We're seeing, I hope they follow through. It looks like they're gutting USAID and NED right now, which is right on the target. Yeah, let's hear it.
Comment from you on the question or the answer. You like?
I think that we have to look at this as, this is Vladimir Putin. He is a lifelong, he is a young man in the KGB. He worked his way up through the system. I think that, as I said in my opening remarks, he believes that one of the most catastrophic events of the 20th century was the dissolution of the Soviet Union. He is not, by the way, somebody who wants to recreate a communist economic system, but I think, is motivated by a kind of nostalgia for at least the political power of that and the Romanov Empire before it. And that is explaining kind of, why he does what he does. If it was somebody else, it's a great what if. I don't know that we would be in this situation. I do think that the inducements of the U.S. With somebody who was more reasonable. There was a lot of hope at one point with when Medvedev was president for 2 years that maybe he would be a different kind of story. But Putin was always in power, even when Medvedev was the president. So in that respect, I would just say I really do think it's important who is agree with Scott on that. It's important who the leader is. Thank you.
Next question.
I want to address a question to Mr. Horton. In your opening remarks, you mentioned how in 2014, basically the West ordered Ukraine to start a war against whom you called the dissidents in the East who didn't accept the revolution and the new government. And I'm wondering if the fact that the leader of the separatist militia was Igor Girkin, who is a retired Russian FSB colonel, who then later proceeded to become the Minister of Defense of the so-called Donetsk People's Republic, and who was also sponsored by a Russian oligarch, Konstantin Malafeyev. He was the leader of this militia and actually is credited for the seizure of one of the cities in Ukraine's East Slaviansk. And I'm wondering, how do you reconcile this, the fact that a Russian former FSB operative curated the whole military movement in the East with this view of yours that it's some kind of a dissident movement?
Oh, well, I agree with your facts on that. I think you overstate a little bit the degree of his control, and I have quite a bit on this in the book. And in fact, there were massive protests in numerous cities in the East, and including the seizure of security force, the SBB or SPB, as national police buildings and so forth. And he did come in later, actually, as many as 6 weeks later, and sort of get at the head of that parade. So it was in the middle of April was when the fighting started, right? And the coup had been sort of at the very end of February. So there had been, and see, part of it was after the loss of Crimea, then I think they overreacted in the East because they thought, oh no, we can't let that happen again. But it's sort of the same answer, and I say this half tongue in cheek, that everybody says about the protest on the Maidan. Well, maybe the USAID and NED and IRI and NRI and Soros and Omidyar and all these European countries, maybe they poured a couple of $100 million into that thing. But hey, you can't deny the agency of the people on the ground. They showed up to protest. They know what side they're on. And it's the same thing in the East. And what they were really doing was they were mimicking the tactics of the people in the Maidan, essentially occupying government buildings and refusing to recognize the authority of the new government. And then how do they respond? After Brennan went to Kiev, they responded by launching an attack with artillery and tanks and airstrikes was the way that it began. And Poroshenko said at the time, this will take a matter of weeks. We're going to roust those bandits right out of there and it'll be over. And that was the start of a horrific war. There are almost 10,000 people killed, I think 9,000 people killed within the first year of it. And then after Minsk II, I think, forgive me, but I believe it was another approximately 4,000 people killed, mostly fighters, but also including civilians on both sides in the intervening years there. And, well, I'm sorry, go ahead. Do you have some?
Yeah, I'm just wondering, how do you make a straight comparison between Russia funding the process in the East, which is led by a former Russian FSB colonel, versus the US sending money to civil society NGOs? What kind of comparison is this?
Well, there were plenty of American and European government employees on the ground there, including, of course, the previously mentioned Assistant Secretary of State for European Affairs, Victoria Nuland, who was essentially, as we heard over and over again, reading the riot act to Yanukovych, dictating to him what he can do and cannot do. Eli mentioned previously the violence on the Maidan and who started it. It depends on, again, when you start the calendar. The very first fighting on the Maidan was started by the protester side. But imagine a massive protest of tens or hundreds of thousands of people in Washington, D.C., overtly financed and supported and visited by Russian or Chinese officials egging them on. And President Barack Obama or Trump or anyone else sitting there and accepting that and taking it. And we know from history when the bonus army camped out across the Potomac River unarmed, they were World War I veterans, but they were unarmed, and they were there to demand their bonuses from World War I, just in a desperate attempt to survive the Great Depression. And President Hoover sent MacArthur and Eisenhower to clear them out at bayonet point. And there's no way in the world that the government of Washington, D.C. would allow protesters to seize government buildings and take over downtown Washington like that, not for one day. And especially, and yes, Putin certainly overstated it when he talks about the Nazis in Ukraine, but it was the Nazis who led the putsch there and who committed the worst of the violence on the protesters' side there. And they are the descendants of those who fought for Hitler in World War II. I have an extended discussion of that in my book as well. And that was a huge part of it. Imagine literally a massive protest movement, the Tea Party plus Occupy, plus the Klan and the Aryan Nation out there occupying Washington, and what Barack Obama would have done about that. It wouldn't have been the National Guard. It would have been the 3rd Infantry Division removing those people.
Comment from you, Eli.
I just want to point something out, that funding civil society training, I mean, a lot of these NED programs and IRI and NDI are like, how to monitor an election, how to, write a political ad or that kind of stuff. Now there was, and you mentioned this in your book, a program where some of Gene Sharp's ideas for civil nonviolent resistance, which is totally peaceful, were taught in workshops to people. But these are people power movements. And the spark for this was not because somebody in Washington said, we want to get rid of this guy, go out in the streets. The spark for it was this incredible betrayal of what Yanukovych had campaigned on, what Ukrainians thought they were going to get when they were going to join the European Common Market, and then have it reversed directly and overtly because Putin vetoed their own sovereign affairs. Now, I think that you really you're discounting what that would mean to a Ukrainian who has memories probably in their family of the Holodomor, a Ukrainian who remembers what it was like when Ukraine didn't have its sovereignty under the Soviet Union, and now their president, who they elected, is being dictated to by Vladimir Putin. I can understand why people would be furious. So I just think that there is a lot that's made of civil society programs in Ukraine. It does not in any way explain why you had hundreds of thousands of people coming out in Maidan because of this terrible kind of affront to their own sovereignty. That's really what it was. Now, listen, it's true. What is it, the Azov battalion or whatever they are? There is Nazi iconography. You can find it in some of these places, and in the hands of less precise journalists than you, Scott, that you find this sort of sweeping thing that they're all must be neo-Nazis or something like that. And there were street toughs among what was largely kind of a peaceful protest. Does that excuse the sniping on the roof from the security services? Does that excuse the crackdown at the very moment they're trying to negotiate an end to the standoff and sort of a way forward? Of course not. So I put the bulk of that blame on the government's own security services, and I just think it is a crisis that was created because of this sort of heavy-handed way that Putin thought he could dictate to another country what their foreign policy, what their economic policy would be.
And can I just add real quick, and a small rebuttal here, that as far as Strelkov, as I talk about in the book, I mean, this guy was a Russian. There are some others too that were with him. But they're the local militias that grew up to fight in the war once it broke out. They were Ukrainians, as well reported from, and I don't cite Russian journalists at all. I cite only Western journalists, German, French, and American journalists who went to the east of the country and observed and reported on. Many of them were defectors from the Ukrainian military. It was verified. Even the New York Times expert C.J. Chivers said that these are Ukrainian weapons, Soviet weapons from the Ukrainian military, from defectors, not supplied by the Russians. And Keith Gessen, who is an expert from the New York Times, was there when they held their big plebiscite election for not quite independence, but pseudo-sovereignty in 2014, and he observed hundreds of thousands of people came out to support that vote and talked about that. So when you talk about Ukrainians were betrayed, some of them absolutely felt betrayed, some of them did not, and particularly in the far south and east of the country. And that does not mean, as you said earlier, I agree, does not mean everybody who's an ethnic Russian in Ukraine wants to be part of Russia any more than any Hispanic in Texas necessarily wants to be part of Mexico, right? That's not, it doesn't follow. However, it is the case that they were much more skeptical of joining up with the European Union and especially with NATO.
Can I just ask you a question? You would concede that the the surface-to-air missiles that shot down the MH17 flight over Ukraine did come from Russia.
Well, that's heavily disputed. And in fact, the Germans reported before that happened that one of the Ukrainians' buck systems was missing. I do concede that it seemed that Bellingcat traced that particular buck missile
UN inquiry
before
said that.
but into Russia and outside. However, importantly, like what was going on was the Ukrainian government had been committing airstrikes against their own people, and they screwed up. It wasn't Russians, it was local Ukrainian militia guys who made a terrible error and shot down a civilian airliner that should not have been in that airspace at all. But they had been attacked, and they were trying to shoot down military planes that were bombing them at the time. But that's not in any way a rationalization for them pulling that trigger. I'm just saying the contrast is with what the narrative was at the time, which was that Putin shot down this plane full of people. When like, no, he didn't. Some idiot militia guys did. Obviously in a war that he's supporting and by the transitive property of what a horrible guy he is and everything, yeah. But they built it into this whole thing of what a blood-soaked mass murderer this guy is, instead of explaining the context of the thing. I mean, who could justify America supporting the government in Kiev bombing their own people from the sky, meaning, in other words, virtually indiscriminately?
Next question.
So I'm of the camp that the United States is the leader of the West and the free world, and they have a moral imperative to defend other democracies and combat autocratic regimes. So a comment that you made earlier when responding to a question was kind of like, oh, the United States may be cutting aid to Ukraine, and like, I hope they do. I apologize if that's a mischaracterization, but that's kind of what I inferred. So I'm curious, how do you believe that the United States does not have a moral imperative to defend other democracies, particularly ones that decided on their own that they'd like to be our allies and defend our interests in addition to theirs?
Okay, well, first of all, calling Ukraine a democracy is a real stretch, especially when you have the United States of America overthrowing their government every time that they vote for the guy that we wish that they hadn't voted for. It's also, as Joe Biden and his own government have said repeatedly, we can't bring them into NATO soon because their government and their economy are so corrupt that they couldn't possibly pass the requirements. If you look at Transparency International, which is a George Soros financed NGO, they put Ukraine down there with the worst African countries in terms of kleptocracy and corruption. So I don't know what Ukraine you imagine in your mind we're defending here, but it's nothing like a Western European state at all. It's a pure kleptocracy. And then the other thing of it is this, and look, George H.W. Bush, he actually considered this at the time, at the end of the Soviet Union. Maybe we should just bring the whole world into NATO. Every country on earth will have an Article 5 guarantee, and no country better ever try to violently change their borders with any other country, or they're going to have to answer to us. That'll be the new world order. We will be the one, USA will be the one world government forever, and there will never be a war again. Except that, obviously, we can't afford that. And obviously, some other sovereign nations have H-bombs. And obviously, there's some places in the world where we just can't get to. For example, we literally cannot defend Taiwan without losing aircraft carriers, without losing thousands and thousands of sailors and airmen in the attempt. It would be an absolute catastrophe if we did. And I don't know everything about them, but I know they have like some pretty good reformers there. What if China rolls into Outer Mongolia? I mean that seriously. Is the United States of America duty-bound, honor-bound to protect Outer Mongolia from China? Or those are the breaks when you're a small, weak country next to a superpower on the other side of the planet, and there's really nothing we can do about it. And wouldn't it be worse if America was over there meddling, which we are somewhat, over there meddling in the government in Outer Mongolia and supporting hardcore anti-Chinese Mongolian nationalists and all kinds of crap that destabilize the situation and make more war likely? You have to recognize that at some point, let's assume, but say despite their very best intentions, the Americans are just not very good at this.
Coming from you, Eli. Yeah.
I reject the idea that the question of Ukraine would require us to defend Mongolia. I mean, obviously, statecraft is about choosing priorities. And I think that, again, we agree that the NATO debacle of 2008 was the worst possible outcome for NATO. I mean, for Ukraine. My argument is that Putin has not tried this with countries that are part of the alliance, and he obviously is trying it and has tried it with Georgia. He has bullied the countries that are not in the alliance. And so if the Ukrainians want to be part of NATO, and they obviously and clearly do, it would have been better to just, if instead of raising the question only to take it away, we would to bring them into NATO. And I think that would have probably deterred a lot of what we're seeing right now. That's my view. But I also agree with you that we have a responsibility, not for moral reasons. I think it is in our interest that, democratic countries do not slide back into autocracy, and that countries that are trying to transition, you're absolutely right. Ukraine is extremely corrupt, and it constantly has rated as very corrupt. But nonetheless, they are making the efforts to try to do that. If they're interested in that, then I think the United States should help these kinds of transitions to democracy. I don't see that as the equivalent of sending FSB or GRU guys into countries to get militias together and giving them advanced weaponry. I don't think that those are the same kinds of things. We are quite open. The NED and the NRI and the IRI have budgets. They are open to things. This is what our policy was. In fact, if you want to go kind of as a history lesson, the reason that these institutes were created is because at a certain point in the late 1970s, it was decided like, well, why does the CIA have to do this covertly? We should be proud of like trying to support democracy. I don't see any problem with that. It is training people on how to like run elections and think about election law, or, have a more transparent legal process and independent judiciary. Those are our values. That is not the same as a kind of pure naked colonial power grab and picking and choosing and so forth. And I would hope that we don't conflate those two sorts of things. I think that, for the most part, well, listen, let me just say this. There's a lot to criticize with any bureaucracy. And I say this, we should say that the original mission is one thing, and there are plenty of things that the NED has done that is not defensible. There are plenty of times when they've probably provided training to, people with very extreme views. So it's not to say that we have to defend everything that they do, but I just don't think that you can compare that kind of civil society NGO training to what Russia is trying to do in terms of trying to control its near abroad.
All right. Can I respond to one thing real quick there? So, and I can't respond to all that, but just for time's sake, I want to respect y'all's time to ask questions. But this has come up a few different times, and I haven't had a chance to respond yet. The war in Georgia in 2008 was started by Georgia. And at the time, it was actually hilarious watching John McCain and Barack Obama and Tom Brokaw in the debate all looking at each other. We're going with that, right? That Russian aggression. In fact, what happened was the government of Georgia attacked South Ossetia because the NATO treaty says you can't join NATO if you don't have settled borders. And they had these two breakaway provinces dating back to the fall of the Soviet Union. And so Mikhail Saakashvili was taking the opportunity, he thought, to resolve that issue and settle his border crisis. But it didn't work. He launched the war. And what was interesting at the time in covering it was all the European media reported it in real time. Georgia attacking South Ossetia. And this is what everybody knew. And even the New York Times the next day got it right. But then the next day they got it wrong. And the narrative was set. Russian aggression, Russia attacked Georgia, Russia invaded Georgia. And in fact, we found out later that Dick Cheney was advocating that George Bush strike the Russian forces coming under the Rocky Tunnel under the Caucasus Mountains, which could have led right to war. And then the New York Times got it wrong for the next few months, but then finally in November of 2008, after the election, they ran a piece where their arms expert, C.J. Chivers, went through and documented how it was Georgia that started the war and how American diplomatic incompetence helped because the diplomats in the American embassy there were so caught up and had identified so closely with their Georgian charges that they lost track of what was really going on there and when they could have stopped him from going that far.
Scott, sure. Your view is not, I'm assuming, that the breakaway Abkhazian secession governments just minding their own business, going about their life, trying to live peacefully, coexisting.
I have a
with
treatment on that in the book.
government. No, we
But
know what
it's-
happened. We know that the Russians were totally sending people in there. There were a series of these
Oh, but
provocations.
the Georgian president at that time was named Gamsakuria. I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right. We're talking 1991, right?
No, I'm talking in terms of under Saakashvili in 2007, 2006.
Oh, I thought you were talking when that broke away.
I'm saying
I'm
when,
sorry.
when Saakashvili launched his operations, it was not in a vacuum. There were a series of these provocations. There were a series of these terrorist incidents that were coming directly from that territory, and the Russian GRU was there provoking all of it. And I'm not basing
Provoking it. Okay.
I'm not basing this on. I'm basing this on these WikiLeaks cables that came out. This is not, by the way.
Chivers actually does a great job of showing how the WikiLeaks cables show what tools the Americans were. Because if you read the WikiLeaks cables, they say Georgia can do no wrong and Georgia did no wrong. And on the continued forensics later, Chivers at the New York Times correctly says actually these guys got it wrong in real time is what happened.
No.
Okay,
Hold on.
guys. Let's agree about you disagree about Georgia and shift back to Ukraine. Next question. Yeah.
Hi. You've touched upon U.S. aid a few times, Scott in particular, and there's breaking news over the weekend about existing U.S. aid employees not complying with the new administration. So I wonder if you could comment on both U.S. aid's role in fomenting the war in Ukraine, as well as what you see for the future of U.S. aid, if that doesn't take us too far off topic.
Sure. Well, I don't know what's going to happen to them at all. I mean, Trump can flip on a dime and change his mind about how far he wants to go on any given thing. I think, overall, I think in the book, I focus a lot more on the National Endowment for Democracy, just because that's where the best journalism is. In fact, I should mention there's this great book called The New Cold War by a Canadian journalist named Mark McKinnon. And it's not Mark McKinnon, who's the Republican strategist. It's Mac Kinnon, the reporter for the Globe and Mail. And it's just an excellent book. And he takes a very neutral line. In fact, he says, by and large, he thinks the color-coded revolutions were probably good for the countries that went through them, but maybe on balance bad because they provoked worse reactions in neighboring countries and clampdowns on NGOs in those countries and that kind of thing. So he's not like, he's very much a down-the-line journalist, not any kind of like opinionated crusader, but he is just far and away the greatest documentarian of what took place and how the NED, the IRI and NDI and their mostly Soros, but also Omidyar affiliated groups, how they ran this operation beginning, I think the first one was in Albania in 1997 after the pyramid scheme thing collapsed and they put in the new guy for the election 98. I believe I had that right. But they did it in Croatia where they turned on their own friend Tudjman, but who died right before the election anyway. And then they did the bulldozer revolution in Serbia, the Rose Revolution in Georgia, Orange Revolution in Ukraine, Tulip Revolution in Kyrgyzstan. They failed with the Denim Revolution in Belarus and the Cedar Revolution in Lebanon in 2005. A lot of y'all remember under Obama, the so-called Green Revolution in Iran, which also failed. And this is essentially, meddling in ways that if it's the Americans, we go completely crazy. I mean, the Chinese funneled a few $100,000, possibly more than $500,000 into the Bill Clinton campaign in 1996. And it was the biggest deal in the world. And it should have been. And quite frankly, look at how absolutely nuts the Democrats and the media went over completely false, and I know me and Mr. Lake agree on this, completely ridiculously false charges of Donald Trump's influence by Russia and being controlled by Russia and then, donating in kind through internet trolls and everything else, DNC hacking and the rest to influence him. That Hillary Clinton said he's an illegitimate president, that he had usurped her rightful throne, and that he, as Alexander Vindman put it, he had no right to set American foreign policy, he had no right to sit in that chair at all, based on things that weren't even true. But think of how caught up people got in the idea that foreigners would have any say whatsoever about what goes on in our country. When Georgia passed a law recently modeled on America's Foreign Agent Registration Act of 1938. They call it a Russia-inspired law. Russia, Russia, Russia. But they never demonstrate that. They never say it's a Russian-inspired law, where it's literally copied from our law. It says if you're a foreign agent representing a foreign power, then you have to register with our government if you're going to participate in American politics, for God's sake. Of course. And they completely freak out about that because they're all on a foreign company's dole. In fact, you might have seen where when they made these announcements about USAID and NED, that people at Ukrainian media organizations started applying for jobs in other places in Eastern Europe because these so-called independent media organizations are almost entirely dependent on foreign funds to keep them going. So they're independent from their own national government, maybe, well, depending on who's in power at the time, but they're certainly not independent from us.
Comment, Eli? Yeah.
To the most part, the National Endowment for Democracy and International Republican Institute, they do not make clandestine donations as the Chinese did to the Democratic Party in the 1990s. They're very open. These are civil society trainings for the most part. And I would say that in all of those color revolutions, the people who did the work and made the decisions were the people power leaders and activists on the ground. I would just, I don't understand. I just think you can't really compare that to sort of clandestine efforts to try to influence elections, because they're quite open about it, that these are these kinds of trainings. A lot of it's kind of boring good government stuff. And usually it is a response to some sort of, horrendous thing that the dictator does, or a stolen election or something like that. I mean, so you can have as many workshops as you want, but you wouldn't have lots of people in, say, I don't know, Serbia against Milosevic if he wasn't a terrible dictator. I mean,
Sure,
so it's like, it's just teaching like techniques. It's like saying, if you want to start a people power movement, you should get everybody to wear yellow one day or something like that.
Yeah, but it's
that
also,
to me is not the same as like financing a foreign, a political party or other kinds of things. I just think you have to make these kinds of distinctions. Or for that matter, what the CIA did to try to keep the communists out of power in like Italy and Greece. That involved like bribing people and all kinds. That's not what the NED does. The NED, I mean, unless you want to say, giving out grants is the equivalent of a bribe, but I don't think that's the same thing at all.
well,
Okay, just one.
Okay.
You get this in the row. I'm going to ask now to solicit all questions, and then the opportunity to answer those questions will be the rebuttal. So ask your question, please.
Hello, I have a question to Mr. Horton.
But he'll answer in the rebuttal. Go on. A little louder. Go ahead.
I strongly disagree with just about every step of your argument. And I believe you said quite a few things that are outright offensive to Ukrainians. But I'm going to restrain myself and ask you a more general question about your sources. Could you please tell us if you speak Ukrainian? Have you been to Ukraine, specifically to Kiev in 2014 or to Donetsk in 2014? Have you interviewed any Ukrainians for your book in official positions or ordinary people? Because I would think that a book about the United States, which doesn't cite any English language source, would not be taken seriously.
All right, thank you for your question. Next question. Any further questions?
I just say one more comment. I just want to say that I am from Donetsk. I grew up there and spent half my life in Donetsk. And I could tell you that in 2014, the Russian forces did not come in later. I know exactly when they came in, on April 12, 2014. They came in with tanks, which they put in the middle of the city on all squares and streets. People and they started taking down Ukrainian flags and replaced them with Russian flags. They arrested and took to the basements people who protested that. And I can tell you what happened before, and I could tell you what happened after. The war in Donbass was started by Russia.
Thank you for your question. Any further questions? Left. Okay. Again, thank you for all your questions. We now go to the final summary portion of the evening. The affirmative goes first. You want to take the podium? You want to stay here? What do you want to do?
okay. Well, am I supposed to answer that first?
You can answer it in your rebuttal. I'm sorry, in your summary as well. You can answer it.
Okay.
Yeah.
No, I haven't been to Ukraine, but I haven't been to Afghanistan or Yemen or Pakistan or Somalia or Libya or Syria, and I wrote books about all those countries too. I stayed home. I've covered foreign policy on my show for 25 years, and I've interviewed all kinds of experts from all over the place. And, I had a friend of mine who, when he picked up my Afghanistan book, he said he was really disappointed. He flipped through all the footnotes and he saw that there are hardly any Afghan language journalistic sources there, or Arabic language journalistic sources there. And he was like, oh man. But then he read the book and he understood that actually this book isn't about Afghanistan so much as it's about the United States of America in Afghanistan, and told from the point of view of what the policy is, what the policymakers are doing here, and what the consequences are there. So I didn't really need to interview people from all different cities in Ukraine to know the things that I know about what happened there. And including that opinion was very divided, especially in the far east of the country at different times. As I said, Keith Gesson from the New York Times witnessed hundreds of thousands of people turning out to vote in the pseudo-independence, the sort of sovereignty vote of that summer. And so that's as far as that goes. But more importantly, I guess I did want to have for my summation here a couple of points about, I think as everybody has heard, remember just back a couple of years ago when the war started, that the entire war party said Ukraine is going to win this war and we have to help them win this war. And they're going to take back every last inch of Ukraine, including Crimea. And anybody who says different is spouting Russian propaganda. They're guaranteed to win. But the thing of it was, if you read the Post and the Times and the Wall Street Journal every day, and you read them really closely, you could see that they admitted, as they just reaffirmed, outgoing Biden administration officials reaffirmed to Time magazine in their exit interview 2 weeks ago or last week, that they never intended for Ukraine to win the war. They knew that Ukraine could not win the war. They're simply overmatched by a much stronger, more populous, wealthier country, and that eventually they're going to lose this land. The question was, at what point to come to negotiations, and how much land were they going to lose? In 2022, in September of 22, the Ukrainians made a brilliant feint in Kharkiv, and then made a huge strike against Russian forces down in Kherson and took back about half of Kherson. And they took back, frankly, all of Kharkiv and drove all of the Russian forces into Luhansk. And at that point, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Milley, said, you boys ought to quit right now while you're only so far behind, because this is your high water mark. And it's going to only get worse from here. And as we know, the New York Times just did a big special about this. Antony Blinken, Secretary of War, has said that it was the State Department weenies, led by Blinken, who overruled the military men and said, no, we're going to have this massive escalation, the massive failed escalation of 2023. And now they've done nothing but lose more men and territory since then. David Ignatius, who's widely regarded, and I mean this seriously, this isn't like an alternative view. He's widely regarded as a CIA spokesman, sort of ombudsman at the Washington Post. He and Walter Pincus, who's I guess now retired. But David Ignatius said, this war has been great. It's been great for the West. It's been great for NATO. We added 2 new countries to NATO, Sweden and Finland. We've convinced all of our Western European allies to increase their military spending. It's been great for everybody involved. Parentheses, literally he used parentheses and said, except for the Ukrainians, who've lost in I don't know the exact numbers, and I'm pretty conservative in my estimates, but they've lost hundreds of thousands of casualties, killed and wounded in this thing. It's been an absolute catastrophe for them, as well as I argue in the book, a Pyrrhic victory at best for the Russians as well. But in that same piece, the Russia hands, where different piece by Keith Gesson, pardon me. The same piece where they talked about Trump has the ship steering wheel, the Russia hands. Strobe Talbot is asked about NATO expansion. And this is from a few years ago, like 2018, in the middle of the so-called low-level war. And Strobe Talbot says, we had to do what was in our best interests at the time. But then I wonder, should we have had a higher, wiser conception of what our true national interest is? In other words, an eye on the betterment of our long-term relationship with Russia as more important than this other stuff? And he says, yeah, maybe. And on the way out, Victoria Nuland admitted that the Russians don't threaten Eastern Europe. They can't. They've proven themselves to be a paper tiger, and her husband, Robert Kagan, admitted that actually Ukraine is no national security concern of the United States whatsoever. They were under the total dominations of Russia since time immemorial and through the whole Cold War, and it never bothered us at all. And that's Nuland and Kagan themselves essentially saying this whole thing was a fool's errand. We shouldn't have done it. We got our friends killed for nothing. It's a disgrace.
Eli, yes, yeah. You get an extra 45 seconds, Eli, because 45 seconds extra for Eli. We can make it up. Go ahead, yeah.
Well, I want to return it to the original question here, which is, was Russia provoked into the war in Ukraine? And I think it is clear that Russia was not provoked, that Vladimir Putin dragged his country into the war because he fantasizes about a lost empire. Now, perhaps we can play all kinds of games where we say, well, what if we did this? What if we offered that? What if this communique or that démarche had said this instead of that or whatever? And I'm here to tell you that none of that really matters. The only thing that a monster like Vladimir Putin will understand is that he must be deterred. And that I think that the real mistake here was not following through and allowing Ukraine into NATO back in 2008. Because the one thing we can point to is we can say that he has not yet attacked a member of that alliance. So I leave it to you as you decide to vote on this final resolution, but I think it's very, very clear. The United States has gone out of its way to try to have peaceful relationship with Russia. It is Russia's leader that has been uninterested in peace. And I just need to leave it there.
That was an incredible conversation. Please join me in a round of applause for Mr. Epstein, Mr. Lake, and Mr. Horton for supplying such a wonderful conversation this afternoon. I would like to remind everyone one more time that the DPU is a nonpartisan organization. And like with all of our events, we do not endorse any views articulated in this conversation. Lastly, I would like to take this moment to advertise the next event of the DPU. On February 20th, we will be hosting a student debate on wealth redistribution and the role of the state. We will now pass it off to the Soho Forum. Thank you all for coming.
I have in my hand the Soho Forum Tootsie Roll that goes to the winner according to Oxford-style rules of this debate. Please open your cell phones and vote again on the resolution yes, no, or undecided. The federal government should, no, that's not the one. I was reading something else. The United States, not the federal government. The United States started the new Cold War with Russia and provoked Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Yes, no, or undecided. Please go back into your phones and vote yes, no, or undecided on that resolution. Whoever moves the vote in his favor gets the Soho Forum Tootsie Roll thrown at him. And I want to mention, reminiscing again, while you're deliberating, that when I was on my way to Dartmouth in November 22nd, Friday of 1963, we debated the resolution the federal government should guarantee a college education to all qualified high school students. That's what we debated that weekend, and that, in fact, was the debate that everybody was supposed to follow nationwide for college-level debates. And on Sunday, we learned that the alleged murderer of President Kennedy had himself been murdered while we were, of course, debating that particular issue. But we don't debate that issue at the Soho Forum. That's an old one. I just want to announce our own schedule that I have in my hand as well, cards from the Soho Forum, and that in New York are cards. If you want a card, you can write me and you can get 2 free tickets to debates we're going to have, for example, in March. And in that one, another incendiary one, the oppression of Palestinians in non-democratic Israel has been systematic and profound. That will be the debate. There'll be somebody there to disagree. In May, we're going to have Harvard professor Cass Sunstein versus Alex Epstein debate the following. People in wealthy nations should pay to protect people in poor nations from serious climate-related damage. So if you're ever passing through New York, you're invited to attend. Go on our website, thesohoforum.org, and you'll see all our debates listed, including those 2. And if you want to write me, if you want a card, I will send you 2 free tickets, because we want to get you interested not just in the wonderful debates run by the Dartmouth Political Union, but in the debates that we run in New York. I'm asking my assistant, do you have the results of the voting? Not yet? Yes, you do? Could you bring it up to me? Because I want to know who to throw the Tootsie Roll at. Okay. All right. The yes vote went from 30.8 to 41 and picked up 10.3 points. The no vote went from 38 to 51 and picked up 12.8, extremely close, a 2 percentage point difference. But it does mean that I'm going to toss the Tootsie Roll at Eli Lake. Congratulations to you both on an extremely close race, and I hope you all felt that both sides were informative. Thanks again for coming, and please keep up the great work at Dartmouth and the great work done by the Dartmouth Political Union. Thank you for having us.